At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. Because, after all, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it that way. I'm Johnny. Let's begin. The gods they had prayed to for a century were about to answer, and Dominar Hask was profoundly, soul-crushingly bored. He stood on the command deck of the dropship Glory of Conquest, a being sculpted from verdant stone and seething impatience. His ornate battle armor, a relic of 1,000 ceremonial duels, felt less like a symbol of imminent victory and more like a restrictive gilded cage. Around him, his elite honor guard, the Scions of Ruin, stood in two silent, unmoving ranks, their massive forms barely swaying as the ship shuddered violently through the final, fiery stages of atmospheric entry. The only light was the angry, pulsing crimson of the screens, displaying descent telemetry and enemy heat signatures that stubbornly refused to appear, casting long, menacing shadows that danced with the vessel's tectonic vibrations. 100 years, Ask rumbled, his voice a low, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the deck plating itself, a sound that could curdle milk in the next star system. A century of study, of ritual, of honing our minds and bodies to a singular, magnificent purpose. His second-in-command, Torg, a warrior only slightly less colossal but far more scarred, nodded sharply. The gesture was so precise it was almost mechanical, a glint of red light reflecting off the polished obsidian of his helmet optics. The scriptures were clear, Dominar. The Terran archives, though tragically fragmented, painted a portrait of a warrior race unlike any other in the known galaxy. Do not quote the archives to me, Torg. I have slept with them under my hay since I was a spawnling, Ask growled, turning his burning, incandescent gaze on his subordinate. The Dominar's eyes were not mere organs of sight. They were furnaces of conviction, the twin hearts of the invasion's psych engine. Recite the litany. Let our conviction be the spirit of this assault. Let our belief be the plasma that scours their world clean. Torg stiffened, his already rigid posture becoming something akin to a statue's. He began the recitation, a catechism known to every Hecht warrior, the very foundation of their crusade. His voice, amplified by his helmet's voxcaster, was a booming testament to faith. We go to face the titans of a strength that shatters mountains, who fuel their muscles with the raw eggs of vanquished beasts and the blood of their enemies. Ask's voice joined his, a booming antiphonal chorus of zealous belief that made the very air hum with power. Warlocks of science who command starships with nothing but a wave of their hand. A planet of kings, each a demigod like the great Conan, the wise Ripley, or the unstoppable Dutch, ruling over fiefdoms of steel and fire, forever locked in glorious, unending combat. The scions shifted as one, a collective metallic rustle of armor and a tightening of grips on plasma rifles the size of Terran motorcycles. This was the sermon they knew. This was the promise that had pulled their species from the brink of stagnant obsolescence. The Hecht, a species whose collective, focused belief could warp the very fabric of reality, had stumbled upon their holy text in a corrupted data cache of 1980s Earth media. They didn't see movies, television shows, or comic books. They saw prophecies. They saw a challenge worthy of their hyper-militarized, evolutionarily dead-ended culture. For 100 years, their consensus field, the psychic energy generated by their united consciousness, had been focused on this single, epic narrative. On their homeworld, the field was a stable, low-grade force used to reinforce their fortresses and quicken their healing. But taking it off-world, to a physically fallow planet like Earth was like bringing a lit match to a galactic-scale gas leak. Without a dominant local belief to resist it, the consensus field would latch onto the strongest one present, their own. It would make their prayers terrifyingly, violently real. For generations, the Dominion has known only peace, Hask boomed, his voice now a solo instrument of conquest, drowning out the alarms and the groaning of the ship's hull. A rotting, stagnant peace that blunts our claws and dulls our spirit. A cancer of tranquility, but no more. Today, we face the gods of terror. We will throw ourselves against their fortress walls, and by our conviction, we will emerge victorious. We will give them the gift of a worthy death, and they, in turn, will grant us the glory of a true conquest. His voice was the psychic anchor, the central pillar of the consensus field that bound every Hecht warrior in the invasion fleet. From the lowest grunt to the fleet master in high orbit, his belief was their belief. His certainty was their reality. "Torg!" Hask commanded, turning back to the main view screen, which was still just a flare of atmospheric heat obscuring the hallowed ground below. "Status! Final descent vector locked, Dominar. Landing zone confirmed. Heart of the Terran continent. A nexus of power, according to the archives. Designation, Havenwood. A fitting name for the Hall of the Slain," Hask mused, a cruel smile briefly touching his lips. "Prepare the assault ramp. I will be the first to set foot on this holy ground. I will be the one to issue the challenge." "Yes, Dominar." The dropship bucked one last time, a gut-wrenching lurch, and then settled with a ground-shaking thud that echoed like the hammer of a titan. A deep, mechanical groan began as the massive assault ramp unlocked, the sound of a promise being fulfilled. A sliver of brilliant, unfamiliar light cut through the red gloom, widening into a blinding rectangle of pure, unfiltered sunlight. Dominar Hask strode to the edge, his massive form silhouetted against the glare. A god of war stepping from his chariot. He had prepared for this moment his entire life. He expected the acrid smell of cordite and superheated metal. He expected the roar of battle, the clash of steel, a horizon of shattered cities and screaming war machines. The ramp slammed down onto the earth with a final, deafening crash. The light washed over him. He saw a neatly paved road, a white picket fence, in desperate need of a fresh coat of paint. A small, slightly peeling wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Havenwood. Population 2,308. A great place to raise your kids." Beyond the sign, a vast, tranquil field of corn swayed gently in a warm, lazy breeze. The air was silent, save for the chirping of some unseen insect and, in the far distance, the lazy, intermittent barking of a dog. Dominar Hask, herald of the good war, annihilator of stagnation, stood at the precipice of his holy crusade, staring at a postcard from the most boring corner of nowhere. A profound, hollow silence echoed in his soul. Sheriff Bill Miller took a slow sip of his coffee. It was lukewarm, bitter, and had the consistency of motor oil, just the way he liked it after it had been sitting on the counter for an hour, stewing in its own mediocrity. "Another cup of that liquid tar, Beth?" he asked, sliding the thick, chipped ceramic mug across the formica. Beth, a woman in her late 20s, whose perpetual expression was a masterclass in weary patience, topped it off from the glass carafe without breaking her rhythm of refilling salt shakers. Her movements were economical, practiced, the motions of someone who had seen it all and was impressed by none of it. "You know, Bill," One of these days, you're gonna dissolve a hole right through that stomach of yours. Then I'll have to mop you up. I'm pretty sure that falls under hazardous waste disposal, which is way outside my job description. Keeps me regular, he grunted. The same reply he gave every Monday. A small ritual in the grand, unchanging tapestry of Havenwood life. The Skillet Diner was quiet, a low hum of familiar comfort. In a corner booth, Dale and Jean, two farmers whose combined age probably predated the invention of the tractor, were engaged in their weekly high-stakes argument over the relative merits of sorghum versus soybeans. Dale, whose face was a roadmap of 80 Kansas summers, was waving a gnarled, soil-stained finger. Sorghum's drought-resistant, Gene. You know this. It's common sense baked right into the damn seed. Drought-resistant don't mean market-proof, Dale. You can't eat principle, and you sure as hell can't sell it at the exchange, Gene shot back, slapping the vinyl seat for emphasis. Bill smiled into his coffee. It was peaceful. It was predictable. It was home. Then, the windows rattled. A deep, gut-thrumming vibration rolled through the diner, making Bill's coffee cup dance a nervous little jig on the counter. The spoons in their metal dispenser chimed against each other. Dale and Jean paused their debate, both looking towards the ceiling as if expecting the Lord himself to descend. Beth looked up from the shakers, her brow furrowed in annoyance. Military flyover from McConnell, Bill sighed, fishing a few crumpled dollar bills from his pocket and laying them next to his mug. He slid off the stool, his left knee sending a familiar, sharp complaint up his leg, a nagging reminder of a youthful misadventure with a ladder and a barn roof. He gave it a perfunctory, useless rub. They're flying lower and lower these days. I think they're trying to scare the crows for us. Probably doing a better job than your scarecrow, Dale. My scarecrow is the County Fair Blue Ribbon Prize winner, Bill, and he has a name. Bartholomew. Show some respect, Dale grumbled, turning his attention back to his lukewarm coffee. Bill limped towards the door, the uneven gait a part of his identity as much as his badge. He was expecting to see the sleek gray delta wing of a B-1 bomber roaring overhead, a familiar sight in this part of the country. He pushed the door open, the little bell above it tinkling with a cheerfulness that was about to be profoundly misplaced. He stepped outside into the warm Kansas sun and squinted up at the big, empty blue sky. The problem wasn't in the sky. It was on the street. Squatting in the middle of Main Street, crushing his freshly repainted crosswalk and cracking the asphalt like an eggshell, was a vehicle the size of a city block. Its surface was a fractal nightmare of sharp angles and dark, featureless metal that seemed to drink the sunlight, leaving a void where reflections should be. It radiated a palpable sense of menace, like a predator that had just settled in for a meal. And Havenwood was the dinner plate. A huge ramp was lowered from its belly, and descending it were figures that defied all logic, biology, and common decency. They were massive, easily 8 feet tall, clad in jagged black armor that looked like it was made from solidified hate, and carrying weapons that looked like they'd been torn from the fever dream of a weapons designer. Their skin, what little was visible, was the color of Granny Smith apples. Bill Miller, a man whose professional life mostly involved ticketing teenagers for speeding, mediating fence disputes, and occasionally helping farmers wrangle escaped cows, stood on the sidewalk and stared. His first thought wasn't fear. It wasn't disbelief. It was a profound, soul-deep, bureaucratic sense of annoyance. Well, hell, he muttered to himself, his gaze fixed on the spiderweb of cracks spreading across his pristine street. That's going to be a mountain of paperwork. Aboard the Glory of Conquest, Hask watched the lone human on his main view screen, a magnified, grainy image that was an affront to his entire religion. An aging male, soft-bellied, moving with a noticeable limp. He wore a simple, light brown uniform, and carried no visible weapon of any significance. This wasn't a Terran demigod. This wasn't Conan or Dutch. This was livestock. This was a groundskeeper. Was this a trick? A cunning Terran deception designed to lure them into a false sense of security? No. The archives were clear. Terran warriors were proud. They met challenges head-on, with oiled muscles and a barrage of witty one-liners. This pathetic display was not a deception. It was an insult, a cosmic joke played at his expense, a 100-year-long shaggy dog story with the universe's worst punchline. Rage. Pure, undiluted, and hotter than a plasma core boiled in his chest. It was the fury of a zealot whose god had just spat in his face. The disappointment of 100 years of fervent prayer culminating in this. The consensus field, anchored by his will, began to thrum and whine, saturated with his boiling, incredulous emotions. The air on the bridge grew thick and heavy, charged with his psychic outrage. "They mock us!" he snarled, his voice a low growl that made Torg flinch, the sound of grinding consonants. "They send out their weakest elder to shame us, to spit on our conviction." "Perhaps their main forces are hidden, Dominar," Torg offered, his own conviction wavering like a candle in a hurricane. "A vanguard of peasants to test our resolve, as described in the scrolls of Rambo. Faint before the true champions emerge. And we shall call them out. We shall scream our challenge into the heavens until the very foundations of this world tremble," Ask roared. He slammed a massive, gauntleted fist onto a console, keying the ship's external broadcast system. He would not be denied his glorious war. If the gods of Terra would not show themselves, he would burn their pathetic cornfield world down until they had no choice. His voice, amplified to an earth-shattering, glass-breaking volume, erupted from the dropship, a wave of pure sound and psychic intent that washed over the sleepy town of Havenwood. "I am Dominar Hask of the Hecht. I have traveled the Sea of Night for a century to find you. I have come for your kings, your titans, your warlocks of science. I have come for your berserkers, your commandos, your lords of the wasteland. I have come for the glory of battle. Face me and die with honor, or cower and die in shame." The shout was more than a sound. It was a declaration of faith, a summary of every Hecht belief about Earth, a psychic payload of 1980s action hero archetypes, a violent, desperate prayer screamed into the heartland and a world wholly unprepared for it. The consensus field, now supercharged with a century of focused expectation and Hask's white-hot rage, flooded Havenwood as a psychic tsunami. The very air warped, shimmering like heat haze on asphalt. The field, finding no strong competing belief system to resist it, the local belief in soybean futures and the outcome of the high school football season being psychically negligible, latched onto the only one present with any power: the Hecht's own fervent, violent, and deeply misinformed expectations. The world of Havenwood, Kansas, began to overwrite itself. The deafening roar knocked Sheriff Miller back a step, rattling his teeth and vibrating deep in his bones. The world in front of him swam, the edges blurring and sharpening in a nauseating pulse. The sun-bleached, cracked asphalt of Main Street darkened, becoming a grittier, meaner shade of black, littered with phantom trash. The cheerful, peeling paint of the storefronts of Henderson's Hardware and the Quilting Bee grew hard and urban, the signs re-rendering themselves in stark, blocky fonts, now reading Ammu-Nation, and the steel hive. The gentle scent of bacon and coffee from the skillet was brutally replaced by the sharp metallic tang of charged air and damp concrete. He felt a deep, powerful hum in his bones, a current of raw, kinetic energy pouring into him like an illegal electric hookup. The chronic, grinding ache in his left knee vanished completely. It was replaced by a feeling of coiled, powerful readiness. He instinctively bent it, then straightened it, a flicker of pure astonishment crossing his face before his expression settled into a hard, determined, unfamiliar mask of grim resolve. He looked down at his hands. The liver spots and soft skin of a man in his late 50s were gone. In their place were scarred, calloused knuckles on hands that looked capable of crushing cement blocks. His tan polyester uniform trembled, the fabric reweaving itself, thread by thread, into black, tactical body armor, complete with ammo pouches, reinforced plating, and a badass-looking leather duster that materialized out of nowhere. His slight paunch didn't just disappear. It was forged into a solid wall of hard-angled muscle that felt like it had been there his entire life. He felt a new, unfamiliar weight on his hips. His old, reliable 6-shot service revolver was gone. In its place, nestled in a thigh holster made of scarred leather, was a massive, nickel-plated hand cannon that looked like it could stop a charging rhino. An identical one was now holstered on his other hip. They felt like extensions of his own arms. Without thinking, he drew both. They cleared leather in a single, fluid motion, a blur of silver and black. They felt perfectly balanced in his new hands. He spun them once in a complex, flashy maneuver he'd only ever seen in old westerns. The motion was as natural and ingrained as breathing. He holstered them with a final, satisfying thump-thump. He was no longer Sheriff Bill Miller of Havenwood. He was something else. He was the lawman, something the Hecht had been dreaming of for a very, very long time. The Hecht honor guard on Main Street froze, their trigger fingers hesitating. The old soft human was gone. In his place stood a figure straight from their most revered combat simulations. The grizzled, lone enforcer, the unmovable object against which the unstoppable force was meant to break itself. They had studied his kind for decades. They knew his tropes. They knew he was faster than their eyes could track, tougher than their ship's armor, and that his aim was unerringly, supernaturally precise. And now he was real. Their belief had made him real. Their faith had forged their own executioner. The lawman raised his head. His eyes narrowed into a steely squint that could chip stone. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to come from the soles of his boots. "All right, fellas," he said, the words tasting strange, and yet perfectly right in his mouth. "Disturbing the peace is a Class B misdemeanor in this town. And right now, you're disturbing the hell out of it." He drew his cannons in a blur of motion too fast for Hecht eyes to follow. The sound of the blast was not the familiar crack of his old .38 Special. It was a deafening, concussive boom that shattered the windows of the newly christened MU Nation behind him. The massive slugs, the size of small zucchinis, hit the first two Hecht warriors square in the chest. Their advanced, layered composite armor, designed to repel plasma bolts and laser fire, crumpled like wet cardboard. The two 8-foot-tall aliens were lifted off their feet and thrown backward a dozen yards, crashing into the side of their own dropship with a sickening, final crunch of metal and bone. The remaining Hecht stared, their disciplined minds short-circuiting at the sheer physics-defying violence. Their reflexes, drilled into them through 1,000 virtual simulations, took over. They raised their plasma rifles and unleashed a volley of searing green energy bolts. The lawman moved with a speed that defied his apparent bulk. He twisted, dived, and rolled behind a now concrete-reinforced public bench, the plasma bolts splashing harmlessly against it. gouging out steaming chunks of material. He came up from one knee, both cannons roaring, each shot a thunderclap of righteous fury. Another Hecht went down, clutching a smoking hole in its torso. A fourth took a round to the head, its helmet exploding in a spray of green ichor and shattered optics. The battle for Earth had begun, and Earth was pissed. In his basement command center, 2 blocks off Main Street, Gary was thrown sideways by the psychic shockwave, tumbling from his worn-out office chair and slamming into a metal shelf stacked high with canned beans and survival rations. The cans rained down on him like clumsy shrapnel as he lay dazed, the scent of dust and preserved peaches filling his nostrils. He pushed himself up, groaning, a trickle of blood from his nose. He blinked, and blinked again. His world had changed. The peeling cork boards that covered his walls, a chaotic, paranoid mess of string, newspaper clippings, and blurry photos of supposed UFOs were gone. In their place was a vast, holographic map of Havenwood. It glowed with a soft blue light, displaying troop movements in real time. Dozens of red icons, shaped like aggressive alien heads and labeled Hecht, were clustered on Main Street. A single flashing blue icon, shaped like a sheriff's star and labeled Lawman, was holding them at bay. His ancient, crackling ham radio set on the desk, a relic held together with duct tape and hope, was now a sleek, black console humming with silent power. Its chunky dials and switches were replaced by smooth, touch-sensitive panels that glowed with an inner cyan light. A high-fidelity headset had materialized beside it. Gary stared at his hands. They were steady. The nervous tremor that had plagued him his whole life was gone. A lifetime of being the town eccentric, the paranoid prepper everyone politely ignored. The man who saw conspiracies and weather balloons had just been vindicated in the most spectacular way possible. The name Gary felt wrong, like an old, ill-fitting coat. A new one, a new purpose bloomed in his mind, fully formed. He was Overwatch. He saw the lawman icon pinned down, red icons beginning to move around the flanks. His eyes darted across the holographic map, spotting their potential assets flickering into existence. Their icons dim, but present. He leaned forward, his hand hovering over the console, before snatching the sleek new microphone. His voice, usually a reedy, hesitant thing that cracked when he ordered a pizza, came out clear, calm, and authoritative. This is Overwatch to all Havenwood assets. Hostile contact on Main Street. Alien invasion in progress, people. This is not a drill. The lawman is pinned and taking heavy fire. I need fire support on his position. Now! Light him up! His voice broadcast on a frequency that didn't exist a minute ago. A frequency of pure, weaponized belief. And all over town, people heard the call. At the Iron Will Gym, a small, sweaty box that smelled of chalk, old iron, and desperation, Todd was halfway through a bench press rep, his face a mask of purple agony as he strained to lift 400 pounds. His spotter, Mark, was hovering over him, screaming encouragement with the fervor of a drill sergeant. Come on, Todd! Push it! Push it! It's all you, bro, for the gains! The psychic wave slammed into them, a jolt so real they both flinched. A hot, electric surge rushed up their arms, replacing the familiar burn of lactic acid with a clean, exhilarating hum of raw, weaponized potential. The iron of the weights in their hands felt alive, hungry, and strangely malleable. The 400-pound barbell in Todd's hands began to contort, as if it were clay. The heavy iron plates on either end expanded, fattening and sprouting gleaming brass-cased ammo belts that fed into the bar itself, which was now reshaping into the receiver and heavy air-cooled barrel of a minigun. For a moment of pure 80s aesthetic absurdity, a pair of useless neon pink fins sprouted from the barrel shroud, wobbling slightly. Todd wasn't straining under the weight anymore. He was holding the monstrous weapon easily, his arms and chest swelling with slabs of new muscle that stretched the fabric of his guns out tank top to its absolute limit. Mark, who had been holding a pair of 80-pound dumbbells, watched in stunned primal glee as they warped in his hands. The handles became grips, the weights elongating into ordnance tubes. They morphed into a pair of massive, shoulder-fired rocket launchers, complete with oversized, entirely superfluous tactical scopes and targeting lasers. His own physique broadened, his straps rising to meet his ears. "Whoa!" Mark breathed, his voice an octave deeper, resonant with newfound power. Todd racked the action of the barbell gun with a deafening clack-clack that echoed through the gym. "Dude!" Then, a voice echoed in their minds, clear as day, cutting through their awe. "This is Overwatch to all Havenwood assets. I need fire support. Light 'em up!" Todd and Mark exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated, testosterone-fueled glee. This was infinitely better than leg day. "Let's get it!" Todd roared, his voice a battle cry. They didn't bother with the door. They turned and sprinted, smashing through the gym's plate glass front window in a glittering shower of destruction. They landed on the sidewalk in twin superhero poses, ignoring the Hecht patrol that was just rounding the corner, their alien jaws dropping in unison. "Eat your vitamins and say your prayers!" Mark screamed, hefting one of his new rocket launchers. He pulled the trigger. The rocket streaked down the street, trailing thick black smoke, and obliterated a Hecht armored transport that had just rolled off the map, turning it into a blossoming flower of fire and shrapnel. Todd set up his minigun on the shattered frame of a newspaper stand, the pink fins wobbling ridiculously. He squeezed the trigger. The weapon spun up with a high-pitched whine and then erupted, laying down a terrifying stream of suppressing fire that chewed up the asphalt and sent the Hecht patrol diving for cover. "Feel the burn!" he hollered over the den. Linda hated Mondays. Mondays were for weeding. She was on her hands and knees in her perfectly manicured front yard, tending to her prize-winning petunias, when a squad of Hecht warriors stomped through her garden on their way to flank the lawmen. One of them, not even looking down, planted a massive, armored boot directly on top of her prize-winning midnight velvet bloom, a flower she had nurtured from a seedling. Linda saw red. A lifetime of quiet suburban frustration, of bake sales, PTA meetings, thankless carpools, and dealing with her husband's inability to put his unmentionables in the hamper, coalesced into a single white-hot point of pure, righteous fury. She stood up. The aches of kneeling in the garden vanished, replaced by a cold, coiled tension in her shoulders, the kind of deadly readiness she'd only ever seen in the action heroines her son watched on late-night TV. She marched back into her house with a newfound purpose in her stride, each step direct and certain. She didn't walk. She stalked. She threw open the silverware drawer in her pristine kitchen. The forks, knives, and spoons were gone. In their place, nestled in a perfectly cut black foam organizer, was a neat row of M67 fragmentation grenades, gleaming like deadly green apples. She stared at them for a solid second, her head tilted as if she were trying to decipher a particularly confusing recipe. Then, a wave of pure, primal instinct washed over her. She plucked a grenade from the foam. She hooked the pin with her teeth, an act she'd only ever seen in movies, but which felt utterly natural, and pulled. She leaned out her kitchen window, wound up like she was throwing a fastball for the major leagues, and lobbed the grenade into the middle of the Hecht squad still milling around in her ruined garden. The explosion of green guts and shattered armor was deeply, profoundly satisfying. Behind her, in the driveway, her beige minivan chimed softly. Its side panels thickened audibly, the sound of locking metal plates echoing in the garage. The roof slid open, and a small, automated turret popped up, swiveling to scan for targets. The soccer mom van had become a battle wagon. A voice, cool and synthesized like a high-end GPS, spoke from the dashboard. "Threat acquisition system online. Ready to protect the perimeter, Linda. 10 miles out of town, at the last chance truck stop, a man known only as Big Earl was sipping coffee in the cab of his 18-wheeler. Sweet Caroline. Gary's voice crackled not from his phone, but from his old CB radio, a device that hadn't worked properly since the Clinton administration. Need fire. Hostile contact on Main. Light 'em up. As Earl listened, the world outside his windshield began to change. The air itself seemed to fill with the phantom sound of a screeching, distorted guitar solo, which grew from a faint echo into a real, physical blast from his speakers, which now glowed with an internal red light. The chrome in his rig caught the sun with an unnatural, blinding intensity. His massive exhaust stacks, polished to a mirror shine, thickened and lengthened, their tops splitting open to reveal clusters of missile pods. The giant steel bull bar on his grill began to crackle with blue, arcing electricity. He looked in his side mirror. The other rigs in the lot were undergoing similar monstrous transformations. A tanker truck was sprouting flame turrets along its path. A flatbed carrying lumber was now covered in what looked like massive, rapid-fire harpoon launchers, the logs themselves sharpening into deadly-looking projectiles. The smell of hot metal, charged particles, and supercharged demon-pissed diesel filled the air. Earl felt a grin spread across his face, a grin that felt both foreign and completely natural. He grabbed the CB handset, which now felt sleek and metallic in his hand. "Breaker 19, this is Big Earl," he drawled, his voice now a booming baritone straight out of a movie trailer. "You got the highway hellions on the move, Overwatch. We're reading you loud and clear. We're about to introduce these green-skinned boys to some real American horsepower. Keep the pedal to the metal and rubber on the road. We're coming in hot." He slammed the truck into gear. A convoy of 8 monstrous post-apocalyptic war rigs thundered out of the truck stop, laying down stripes of burning rubber as they roared towards Havenwood, a symphony of air horns heralding their apocalyptic arrival. Dominar Hask stared at his holographic command map, a kaleidoscope of tactical madness. The lone lawman icon was no longer alone. He was now supported by 2 icons labeled Gym Bros. A new symbol, Battle Wagon, was providing deadly accurate cover fire from a suburban lawn, and a whole squadron of units designated Highway Hellions was approaching from the west at speeds that defied physics, their icons shaped like flaming skulls. He'd gotten his wish. The glorious battle was here. It was all around him, and it was a humiliating, nonsensical nightmare. A frantic report flashed across his screen. An energy reading of a magnitude that overloaded the sensors had just been detected from the local high school. A scout flyer sent to investigate was sliced cleanly in half by a writhing, unstable beam of coherent light fired from what appeared to be the chemistry lab. The pilot's last transmission was a panicked scream about a nerd with a laser. "Report from Sector Gamma!" an officer yelled with the comm station on the bridge, his voice cracking with disbelief. "The town library! We breached it! But they weaponized the Dewey Decimal System! Our troops are being trapped in narrative loops! Sergeant Brack is now convinced he is a character in something called a cozy mystery and is refusing to fire his weapon! He's investigating a clue involving a missing scone!" This wasn't war. This was farce. His warriors, bred and trained for a century to fight honorable, predictable gods of war, were being routed by amateurs. By farmers and mechanics and housewives who had been force-fed archetypes they barely understood but were executing with a terrifying, unthinking directness that left no room for tactical finesse or honorable single combat. It was his fault, his belief, his prayer. It had been answered with a malicious, literal exactitude. Every misinterpretation and trope made terrifyingly real. Humiliation burned in him, a far more potent fuel than rage. There was only one way to salvage this. He had to recenter the consensus field. He had to find the heart of their resistance, the single strongest champion this chaos had produced, and break them personally. His victory, his absolute dominance over their greatest hero, would overwrite this humiliating narrative and restore the glorious, predictable combat he craved. The glory of conquest shuddered violently as one of the highway hellions, a converted cement mixer now firing explosive balls of quick-drying concrete, scored a direct hit on the landing ramp hydraulics. Alarms blared. The ramp was stuck in the down position. They were grounded. Hask made his decision. He would not cower on his bridge while his legacy was shredded. He would wade into the glorious, stupid chaos he had wrought. "Torg, with me! The rest of the Scions form a perimeter. We go to the heart of it," he bellowed. Abandoning his command post, Hask stormed down the ramp, his plasma axe humming with lethal energy. He stepped onto the desecrated main street of Havenwood and took it all in. The air was thick with smoke. The gym bros were using a downed Hecht fighter as a makeshift incline bench for chest presses between volleys of rocket fire. The lawman was calmly reloading his cannons behind the cover of an overturned ice cream truck. Hask roared a challenge, a sound of pure frustration and battle lust, and charged into the fray. His senses, amplified by the field, were locked onto a single point, a nexus of burgeoning, focused belief emanating from the skillet. It was the only building still mostly intact, a beacon of mundane normalcy in a sea of 80s-fueled war. This was it, the final boss, the champion he needed to defeat to reclaim his glorious war. Beth was crouched behind the diner counter, clutching the only weapon she could find, a heavy, cast-iron skillet. The world outside had gone completely, certifiably insane. She'd peeked over the counter once and seen Sheriff Miller, looking like he'd walked off a movie set, firing guns the size of small cannons. She had decided, very rationally, that the floor was the safest place to be. Then the front door of the diner exploded inward, blasted off its hinges by a bolt of green plasma that vaporized the "Please wait to be seated" sign. Standing in the ruined doorway, silhouetted against the fires of Main Street, was the biggest alien she had ever seen. He was a mountain of green muscle and black armor, radiating an aura of pure, focused rage that felt like a physical force. His eyes, burning with a fanatical light, swept the room and locked directly onto her. Hask had found his champion. His will, the full, concentrated, amplified power of the Dominar, zeroed in on the terrified waitress cowering behind the counter. He was looking for a final boss, a titan of combat, the ultimate adversary. The consensus field, guided by this incredibly specific and powerful intent, surged into Beth like a bolt of lightning. 1,000 times more potent than the initial generic wave that had washed over the town, this was a direct, focused psychic fire hose of pure, unadulterated final boss energy. Beth felt a strange, terrifying power rush through her. Her fear was momentarily washed away by a surge of something else. Confidence, showmanship, an overwhelming urge to play to a crowd that wasn't there. For a split second, her face registered a look of pure, unadulterated, "You have got to be kidding me," exasperation as she rolled her eyes at the sheer cosmic absurdity of it all. Then, the transformation took hold. Her checkered waitress apron rippled, the fabric turning to gold-plated leather, morphing into a wide, gaudy, impossibly ornate championship wrestling belt emblazoned with the words "Intergalactic Champion" in glittering diamonds. Her thin, weary frame expanded with an audible creak of bone and sinew. Muscles coiled and tightened under her skin, ripping her cheap uniform to shreds. She grew 3 feet, her head nearly brushing the ceiling, her shoulders now wider than the diner's door frame. She was yoked. She was ripped off her tits. She was a goddess of gains, a Valkyrie of vascularity. The cast iron skillet in her hand thickened, warped, and reshaped itself into a heavy, brutally simple folded steel chair. Just then, Todd, one of the gym bros, his minigun out of ammo, peeked into the diner to see what the commotion was. He saw the newly apothecized Beth, her muscles gleaming with a faint sheen of sweat and psychic energy. His jaw dropped. A look of profound, brotherly respect dawned on his face. "Whoa, dude," he whispered in awe. He jogged over, his own ridiculously muscled frame dwarfed by hers. "Sis," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He extended his massive hand. Beth, acting on an instinct she didn't know she had, met his gaze. She understood. She grabbed his hand, their biceps bulging like cannonballs. They locked grips. "Dylan, you son of a bitch!" a phantom voice seemed to echo as their hands clasped. A deafening thunderclap erupted from the point of contact, a sonic boom of pure, concentrated badassery that blew out the remaining windows of the diner. A ripple of visible kinetic energy shot through the air. In the corner, the diner's old jukebox, which hadn't worked since 1997, sparked to life with a crackle of static. It didn't play a golden oldie. It began to blast the thunderous opening of Bonnie Tyler's "Holding Out for a Hero," a power ballad so anthemic and on the nose it screamed main event. Ask bellowed, ignoring the sheer, blatant absurdity of the scene. The jukebox, the belt, the chair, the thunderous handshake, it was all just battle regalia. This was it, the final duel, the glorious climax that would redeem this entire debacle. This was the champion he was born to defeat. He charged, his massive plasma axe held high, a roar of 100 years of waiting on his lips, ready to cleave his opponent in two. Beth, the intergalactic champion, acting on an instinct she never knew she possessed, moved with a surprising nimble grace. She sidestepped his telegraphed, honor-bound swing as the plasma axe buried itself in the linoleum floor with a sizzle of melting vinyl. She brought the steel chair down across Hask's broad, armored back with a deafening, echoing, deeply undignified clang that resonated through the entire town. Hask staggered, his ears ringing, a grunt of pure shock escaping his lips. His armor had absorbed the worst of the blow, but the sheer kinetic force and the sheer disrespect of the attack stunned him. In all his studies of Terran combat, in all the sacred archives, nothing prepared him for being hit with a piece of folding furniture. While he was stunned, Beth didn't press the attack with a follow-up strike. She dropped the chair. In a flash, she ducked under his arm, hooked her own impossibly ripped arms around his thick waist from behind, and locked her hands in a grip of adamantine steel. With a roar that rivaled Hask's own, a guttural cry of pure physical power, she lifted the 500-pound alien general clean off his feet and into the air. For a moment, Dominar Hask, conqueror of worlds, supreme leader of the Hecht invasion fleet, was suspended upside down, his legs kicking uselessly, staring at the greasy, water-stained ceiling of a Terran diner as a power ballad reached its crescendo. Then, with a final, guttural "Kya!" Beth arched her back, her spine a whip of pure power, and slammed him down. The move was perfect, a flawless, textbook German suplex. Hask's armored head and shoulders hit the Formica counter first. The counter didn't just crack, it exploded in a shower of splintered wood, shattered laminate, and flying sugar packets. Hask, the mighty Dominar, lay twitching in the wreckage, his belief in honorable combat, and several of his cervical vertebrae, utterly shattered. The defeat of a Dominar is not like the defeat of a normal general. Hask was the psychic anchor, the central processing unit for the entire Hecht consensus field. His conviction was the bedrock upon which their reality-warping power was built. And in that moment, as he lay broken in the ruins of a breakfast counter, his consciousness reeling from the concussive impact, and the ultimate humiliation of being defeated by a professional wrestling move, his conviction imploded. His mind, which for a century had been a fortress of zealous belief in glorious combat, was flooded with a single, overwhelming emotion. Pure, ego-crushing, pathetic humiliation. It was the psychic equivalent of a black hole opening where a star used to be. This catastrophic psychic event ripped through the link connecting him to every Hecht warrior in the system. A Hecht trooper taking aim at the battle wagon suddenly screamed and dropped his rifle, clutching his head as his mind was filled with the phantom sensation of his own spine being snapped over a cheap counter. A pilot maneuvering his fighter through the town suddenly felt an overwhelming wave of shame and inadequacy, causing him to pull up and flee. On the command ship high in orbit, the fleet master collapsed to his knees, his mind filled with the raw, undiluted primal terror and shame of his leader, completely overriding all images of glory and conquest. The consensus field reversed its polarity. Hask's absolute belief in honorable war was instantly and mechanically overridden by his new, even more absolute belief that he was a humiliated failure in mortal terror. This new belief became the signal. The Hecht invasion force broke, dissolving from a retreat into a mindless, panicked rout. Their higher brain functions were swamped by the feedback loop of their leader's utter disgrace. They dropped their weapons. They abandoned their vehicles. They turned and fled in a mindless panic stampede, trampling their own wounded in a desperate scramble to get back to their ships. On the bridge of the fleet's command vessel, the acting officer, his face pale and his mind reeling from the psychic recoil, screamed the only order that made sense, his voice a terrified shriek. "Full withdrawal! Evacuate the system now! By the great dark, now!" The invasion of Earth, 100 years in the planning, was over in less than an hour. As the last enemy ship vanished, tearing a silent, angry rift in the sky before disappearing, the oppressive, crackling energy that had saturated Havenwood evaporated like morning mist. The psychic hum that had vibrated in everyone's bones faded, leaving behind a profound, ringing quiet, and a town collectively blinking, as if waking from the strangest, most violent dream of their lives. The world softened. On Main Street, Sheriff Bill Miller grunted as a sharp, familiar pain shot up his left leg. His knee was back. He looked down. He was wearing his comfortable tan polyester uniform again, a slight paunch pressing against the fabric. The massive hand cannons on his hips were gone, replaced by the comforting, familiar weight of his old service revolver. The concrete bench he'd used for cover was splintered wood again. In her front yard, Linda stared at her perfectly intact, prize-winning petunias, a faint memory of righteous fury and the satisfying arc of a thrown object fading from her mind. Her beige minivan sat quietly in the driveway. A "My child is an honor student" bumper sticker, its only notable feature. The synthesized voice was gone. The highway hellions found themselves pulling into the Havenwood town limits in a perfectly normal, law-abiding convoy of semi-trucks, collectively wondering why they were in such a catastrophic hurry. Big Earl blinked, the last echoes of a wailing guitar solo fading from his ears, replaced by a half-forgotten country song on the radio. In the wreckage of the skillet, Beth stood over the groaning, defeated form of Dominar Hask. The championship belt was gone. Her muscles had receded, her waitress uniform hanging loosely on her normal frame. In her hand, she held a simple, slightly bent cast-iron skillet. She looked from the dazed alien to the skillet and back again, her expression one of profound, utter confusion. "Did I do that?" she whispered. A few hours later, after a very flustered call to some government number he wasn't supposed to have, Sheriff Miller stood by, sipping a genuinely hot coffee someone had brought him from a thermos. He watched as a team of silent men and women in nondescript black suits and sunglasses loaded the Hecht survivors, including the catatonic, whimpering Hask, onto an unmarked, black-painted transport helicopter with swift, unnerving efficiency. The lead agent, a woman with an unnerving, calm demeanor and eyes that missed nothing, handed him a clipboard. "Just sign here, Sheriff," she said. "Standard non-disclosure and planetary defense cooperation agreement, Section 7P, subsection Alpha, hostile first contact via reality warping." Bill looked at the 20 pages of dense legalese. "What exactly am I signing?" "Basically," she said, not smiling, "it says this never happened. And if it happens again, you're our first line of defense. Congratulations on the promotion, Sheriff. Welcome to the program." He sighed and signed the form. More paperwork, of course. Meanwhile, in his basement, Gary fiddled with his now ancient ham radio. The holographic map was gone, replaced by his familiar corkboards covered in string and clippings. But something had lingered in the circuits. A frequency, a ghost in the machine. He had spent the last 2 hours tracking the Hecht fleet's panicked FTL retreat vector, cross-referencing it with deep space listening post data he shouldn't have been able to access. He calibrated his system, took a deep breath, and keyed the microphone. He cleared his throat, broadcasting a simple message across the interstellar gulf, a final postscript to the shortest and most bizarre invasion in galactic history. "This is Havenwood, Kansas, to the Hecht Dominion fleet," he said, his voice once again his own, but with a newfound sliver of steel that was all his. "We just wanted to pass along a little friendly advice for next time." He paused for effect, letting the silence stretch across the light years. A silence filled with the humiliation of an entire species. "If you come for the kings, you better not miss."